Today in the Daily Dose, the Protestant Reformation. Beginning with the publication of Martin Luther's 95 Theses in 1517, and ending anywhere from the 1555 Peace of Augsburg to the 1648 end of the 30 Years' War, the Protestant Reformation was led by a string of prolific theological reformers who skillfully employed the power of the printing press under a common theme of purifying the traditions of the Catholic Church with a more Bible-centric source of spiritual authority and guidance. After Martin Luther was excommunicated by the Catholic Church for protesting the Pope's sale of reprieves for dead sinners trapped in purgatory, he was sheltered in Saxony, where he translated the Bible into the German for Christians who had grown weary of the non-biblical corruptions and loopholes pandemic in the Catholic Church. By the Reformation's end, Lutheranism had become the state religion throughout Germany, Scandinavia, and the Baltics. Next came the Swiss Reformation beginning in 1519, where Ulrich Zwingli's sermons closely matched the teachings of Luther, while in 1541, French Protestant John Calvin settled in Geneva after decades in exile for writing his heretical Institutes of the Christian Religion. Calvin stressed humanity's predestined fate through God's absolute sovereignty over the salvation of the human soul from death and eternal damnation. His teachings soon spread Calvinism into Scotland, France, Transylvania, and the Low Countries, where Dutch Calvinism flourished for the next 400 years. England's Reformation arose through much less dogmatic considerations, after Pope Clement VII refused to annul King Henry VIII's marriage to Catherine of Aragon. In response, Henry dissolved the Catholic Church, confiscating all monastic wealth for redistribution to his own coffers, as well as the Protestant Church of England. In 1536, Henry mandated every parish throughout England was required to have their own Bible, so that every Christian layman could hear and learn the unadulterated Word of God. After Henry's death, Britain embraced Calvinist Protestantism during Edward VI's 6-year reign, followed by 5 years of reactionary Catholicism under Mary I. During Elizabeth I's 44-year reign, she cast the Church of England as a middle way between Calvinism and Catholicism, issuing a revised Book of Common Prayer. To counter the threats caused by the Protestant Reformation, a counter-Reformation or Catholic revival movement took place in the Catholic Church. The period ushered in a more spiritual, less corrupt brand of Catholicism, witnessing orders like the Jesuits, who combined rigorous spirituality with globally minded intellectualism. Despite these latent attempts by the Catholic Church, Europe's new religious and political freedoms came at an enormously high price, including rebellions, wars, and fierce persecutions, at the same time strengthening intellectual expression in education, art, and music, making the Protestant Reformation a bold turning point in the religious freedoms of man. John Milton. Born in 1608 London, England, John Milton was one of 3 children born to John and Sarah Milton, who survived into adulthood, attending Christ College, Cambridge, where he received a Bachelor of Arts degree in 1629, followed by a Master's of Arts in 1632, earning the nickname Lady of Christ for his delicate looks and puritanical chastity, at the same time becoming fluent in multiple languages, including Latin, Greek, Italian, Hebrew, French, and Spanish. Spending the next 6 years with family in Buckinghamshire, Milton wrote On the Morning of Christ's Nativity, on Shakespeare, El Allegro, Il Penseroso, and Lycidas, the later in memory to a friend who had drowned. During his travels across Europe in 1638, 30-year-old Milton met Galileo Galilei in Florence. When the great astronomer was old and blind and under house arrest for his heretical beliefs in a heliocentric universe, rather than the Earth-centric model as described in the Bible, a meeting which proved to be a tragic foreshadowing of Milton's own impending blindness and arrest in his years to come. Returning home early due to the impending English Civil War, while Milton believed in the inerrant authority of the Bible, he vehemently opposed institutions like the Church of England due to its incestuous ties to the monarchy. In response, Milton wrote pamphlets supporting Oliver Cromwell during the English Civil War, following the beheading of King Charles I and the rise of the Commonwealth of England. Imprisoned for his role in the Civil War, upon his release, Milton married for a third time before publishing his 10-volume epic poem Paradise Lost in 1667, which tells the story of Satan's fall from grace and Adam and Eve's expulsion from the Garden of Eden, a masterwork which he had dictated to his assistants due to blindness caused by his addictive dedication to scholarship and the written word. Considered by many to be the greatest epic poem ever written in English, Milton published a revised 12-volume version of Paradise Lost in 1674, before passing away that same year due to complications from gout. 63 years later, his achievements were memorialized by the dedication of a monument in Westminster Abbey's Poets' Corner, making the life and writings of John Milton a standout icon in the history of English literature. Thomas Hobbes. Born in 1588 Malmesbury, England, Thomas Hobbes attended Magdalen Hall and later Oxford University after his father, a disgraced vicar, abandoned the family when Hobbes was still a young boy. Becoming a tutor first for the eldest son of Lord Cavendish of Hardwicke and later several other Cavendish family members, Hobbes traveled to continental Europe where he met such notables as Francis Bacon and Ben Jonson, later publishing his first book on philosophy entitled Short Tract on First Principles. His association with the Cavendish family also placed him in circles close to the king, members of parliament, and wealthy landowners, helping to shape his later writing on politics and the governance of man. A staunch royalist, in 1640, Hobbes wrote an essay defending King Charles I, later expanded into his first book of political philosophy entitled The Elements of Law, Nature, and Politic. And despite Hobbes's professed belief that only strong kingly governance could hold a society together, King Charles I was executed during the English Civil Wars of 1642 to 1651, forcing Hobbes to flee for France for his own personal protection. Developing a strong interest in the sciences and mathematics, most notably Euclidean geometry and optics, Hobbes was embraced by fellow polymath Varennes Marsan and his Parisian circle of academics, at the same time publishing his Elements of Philosophy trilogy, Concerning the Citizen, Concerning Body, and Concerning Man, in which he attempted to arrange the sciences, psychology, and politics into a hierarchy from the most basic to the most specific. Sparring frequently with the likes of Descartes, a relationship bristling with a mix of respect and disregard, after his return from France following the end of the English Civil Wars, Hobbes published his magnus opus, Leviathan, which has since become an essential Western primer on statecraft and governance, a book that heavily influenced Enlightenment thinkers such as John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Immanuel Kant. In Leviathan, Hobbes maintains that without strong leadership in the form of parliament and a king, humanity's ultimate self-serving nature would lead to a state of perpetual war, fear, amorality, and chaos. Turning his attention to his boyhood passion for the classics, in his later years, Hobbes translated Homer's The Odyssey and the Iliad into English, before passing away on December 4, 1679, making Thomas Hobbes a foundational thinker at the dawn of the Age of Enlightenment. the English Civil Wars. After King Charles I dismissed Parliament in favor of his own authority to rule England, the king attempted to reinstill Catholic traditions into the Church of England, sparking fierce resistance amongst Scotland's Presbyterian majority. And after the Scottish army soundly defeated the king's army before invading England, Charles was forced to reseat Parliament in 1640 in an attempt to settle the conflict, a governing body that quickly restricted the king's authority over England, Ireland, and Scotland. Tensions continued to rise in October of 1641, when Ireland's Catholic majority massacred hundreds of Protestants, and when disagreements about how to respond broke out between Parliament and the king in January of 1642, Charles fled to northern England after his attempts to arrest 5 opposing parliamentarians had failed. As royalist forces known as Cavaliers took control of northern and western England, by the start of the First English Civil War in August of 1642, parliamentarians known as Roundheads took control of southern and eastern regions of the country. Alliances between Royalist and Irish Catholics on the one hand and Roundheads and Scottish forces on the other led to the Battle of Marston Moor on July 2, 1644, leading to a Royalist defeat at the hands of a much larger parliamentarian army. Forming England's first permanent army of 22,000 men, led by Sir Thomas Fairfax and Oliver Cromwell, the Royalists suffered a second defeat at the Battle of Naseby in June of 1645. During the Second English Civil War of 1647 to 1648, Scottish and Royalist forces were again defeated in a series of armed uprisings across England in the spring and summer of 1648, leading to the arrest, trial, and beheading of King Charles I on January 30, 1649. During the Third English Civil War of 1649 to 1651, Cromwell led his New Model Army on a successful reconquest of Ireland, including the horrific massacre of thousands of civilians and Irish Royalist forces at Drogheda. By war's end, an estimated 200,000 English soldiers and civilians were killed during the 3 English Civil Wars, proportional to losses suffered in World War I, given the population of England during her wars. Installing Cromwell as Lord Protector of the Commonwealth of England, Scotland, and Ireland, after his death in 1658, King Charles II resumed the throne in May of 1660, beginning a period known as the English Restoration, making the English Civil Wars a worst hard time in the history of Great Britain. The Great Fire of London. After 2 long years of a bubonic plague outbreak that took the lives of some 25% of the city's population, by September of 1666, conditions were rife for disaster, inflicting months of dry weather upon a city made up of narrow lanes, packed housing, and tinder-dry wooden structures. Beginning on September 1st, when the baker for King Charles II, Thomas Varennes, went upstairs to bed without properly dousing his oven, shortly after midnight, sparks from his still smoldering embers ignited aged firewood lying on the floor next to his oven, which quickly engulfed his home in flames. Helping his family and one servant escape through an upstairs window, his assistant baker died in the blaze, the first victim of the 4-day conflagration to come. Fueled by a hot easterly breeze, fire from Varennes' bakery quickly leapt across Pudding Lane, setting fire to straw and fodder in the stables of the Star Inn, before spreading onto Tam Street, where riverfront warehouses exploded in flames, igniting flammable materials such as lamp oil, alcohol, and coal. Locals soon abandoned their attempt at bucket brigade fire abatement, instead rushing home to evacuate their families and save as many valuables as they could. As fire spread throughout the city, authorities struggled to create fire breaks for containment, making futile efforts to tear down buildings before flames pushed them back from their uncompleted task. Many Londoners escaped into the Thames River, while others took to the hills on the outskirts of London, away from a blaze that could be seen from 30 miles away. After the last flames were extinguished on September 6th, Londoners counted the destruction of 13,200 homes, 90 churches, and scores of public buildings, destroying 4/5 of London while displacing an estimated 100,000 people. Within days, King Charles II set about rebuilding his capital, this time employing brick and stone construction while separating new townhomes by thick firewalls, at the same time outlawing narrow alleyways and making streets wider than before. Miraculously, only 16 Londoners perished in the 4-day blaze, making the Great Fire of London yet another catastrophic moment in the city's nearly 2,000-year history. The Great Plague of London. Caused by the transmission of the Yersinia pestis bacteria from rats to humans, born on the Xenopsilla Cheops fleet before the age of scientific understanding. Black Death or bubonic plague ravaged Europe in 1347 and 48, returning to London 3 times before its 4th and final outbreak in 1665. Symptoms of bubonic plague include fever and chills, severe headaches and malaise, nausea, vomiting, seizures, delirium, and death. Derived from the ancient Greek word bubo, meaning swollen gland, buboes generally appear in the armpits and groin of their victim. Other symptoms include petechia, or bruised purplish skin splotches on the chest, back, and neck, known as God's tokens, since petechiae always meant that the victim had a fatal case of the disease. Diarists also reported that victims who appeared to be on death's doorstep from plague smelled like they were as well. First suspected in late 1664, by April of 65, Black Death spread in an easterly direction from the down-and-out suburb of St. Giles onward through the crowded, rat-infested neighborhoods of Whitechapel and Stepney, finally overtaking the walled city of London. By September of 1665, death rates exceeded 8,000 per week, as helpless government officials abandoned all notions of quarantining the dead and dying. Wealthy Londoners soon fled for the countryside, while the destitute poor wandered the streets in fear, listening to the sound of "Bring Out Your Dead" as city workers stacked plague victims on carts bound for parish graveyards or communal plague pits such as Finsbury Field or Southwark. Fearing cats and dogs as the source of the contagion, tens of thousands were put down out of an abundance of caution, while physicians lanced the buboes of plague victims under the Galenistic misconception that a cure could be achieved by releasing trapped ill humors. Diarist Samuel Pepys wrote of desperate people aimlessly wandering the streets, later writing that bells rang out constantly, announcing the death or burial of yet another plague victim. The Great Plague ended on September 2, 1666, when fire broke out in the King's Bakery on Pudding Lane, burning much of London to the ground over the next 4 days of conflagration, torching some 13,200 homes and businesses, which forever reshaped the geographic footprint of central London. Taking some 100,000 lives, roughly a quarter of London's population at the time, the Great Plague was the last to strike the city after centuries of sporadic outbreaks, making the Great Plague of 1665 yet another worst hard time for London town. Isaac Newton. Born in 1643, Lincolnshire, England, Isaac Newton's father passed away 3 months before Newton's birth, foregoing a farmer's life to attend Cambridge University as a young man, where he devoted himself to the study of physics, the motion of planets, and mathematics. When the Great Plague shuttered Cambridge in 1665, Newton returned home to the family farm, formulating his theories on calculus, light, and color, while a falling apple supposedly inspired his work on gravity. Returning to Cambridge in 1667, a year later, Newton built a telescope before earning a Master of Arts degree and a professorship in mathematics. In 1671, after demonstrating his telescope to the Royal Society of London, he was elected into that same learned body the following year. Due to his experiments into light refraction, Newton drew sharp criticism from Society member and scientist Robert Hooke when Newton pronounced that light was composed of particles rather than waves. Known for his ardent, if not temperamental, defense of his work, Newton suffered a nervous breakdown after several heated letters with Hooke, withdrawing from the public eye in 1678 to further his study of gravity. At the behest of English astronomer Edmund Halley, Newton published his masterwork Principia Mathematica in 1687, which laid down his 3 laws of motion by stating that every object in a state of uniform motion will remain in that state of motion unless an external force acts upon it. Force equals mass times acceleration, and for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. Principia made Newton a rock star of sorts in intellectual circles, while his work became a founding element of the European Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. Following the Glorious Revolution of 1688, Newton was elected Cambridge University's representative in Parliament, moving to London for the remainder of his life after being named Warden of the Royal Mint in 1696. His second major work, Optics, detailed Newton's thorough experiments into light refraction and the color spectrum, as well as his thoughts on energy and electricity, before earning a knighthood from Queen Anne of England in 1705. He also is viewed by many as the father of calculus, although scholars later concluded that German mathematician Gottfried Leibniz may have discovered calculus at the same time yet independent of Newton. He passed away in his sleep on March 31st, 1727, but not before delivering the words, "I can calculate the motion of heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people." Vivaldi and the Figli del Coro. No matter where a traveler to 17th century Venice turned an ear, they could hear music pouring out of churches and buildings both night and day. Composers of the day seized on the skills of virtuoso singers and musicians, creating solos that pushed the boundaries of the best players' abilities. Venetian composer Antonio Vivaldi, known as Il Prete Rosso, or the Red Priest for his flaming red hair, became the form's undisputed leader. Vivaldi's creativity was facilitated by a particular group of musicians who could learn new music quickly on a staggering array of instruments. Drawing acclaim from emperors, priests, and princes, they were the all-female cast of orphans known as the Figli del Coro, or Daughters of the Choir. Only in Venice, a prominent visitor wrote, can one see these musical prodigies. They sing like angels, play the violin, the flute, the organ, the oboe, the cello. In short, no instrument is large enough to frighten them. An expense report that Vivaldi recorded in 1712 indicates that he spent 20 ducats on a violin for 16-year-old Anna Maria, who was the best of all the Figli, and an expenditure that equaled 4 months of Vivaldi's income. The fact that the women Figli sang and played behind thin crepe curtains drove many to frustration, including rebel philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who confessed that he was driven to despair, and when he finally got an audience with the Figli, he was horrified by their general deformity and disfigurement. There was Sophia, he wrote, who was horrid, while Catina had but one eye. Bettina was entirely disfigured by smallpox, while scarcely one of the Figli was without some striking defect. The girls and women who delighted delicate ears had not lived delicate lives. Many of their mothers worked in Venice's vibrant sex industry, who then passed their syphilis diseases onto their babies when they were dropped off at the Ospedale della Pietà, or Hospital of Pity, where the girls subsequently grew up and mastered music. After the plague of 1630 that wiped out 1/3 of the Italian population, Venetians found themselves in a penitential mood, as one historian put it, and when the Ospitali governors saw a rise in church attendance and donations because of the girls' musical skills, the Figli del Coro skyrocketed to fame. The French Revolution. After years of rising unemployment, bad harvests, inflated food costs, and extravagant spending by King Louis XVI, not to mention France's expensive involvement in the American Revolutionary War, unrest among starving, overtaxed peasants and urban poor tipped into violence in the spring of 1789. Fed up by legislative rules that allowed an aristocratic minority to overrule the majority, widespread social distress led to the convocation of the Estates General in May of 1789. In June, the estates or houses of the French legislature were converted into a national assembly, which passed a series of radical measures, among them the abolition of feudalism, state control of the Catholic Church, and extended voter rights. Parisians panicked after rumors of an impending military coup began to circulate, leading to the storming of the Bastille, as citizens sought to secure gunpowder and weapons for their defense. For the next 3 years, French leaders vied for political control, while external powers such as Prussia, Austria, and Britain grew increasingly fearful of French revolutionaries infecting their own countrymen, leading to the outbreak of the French Revolutionary Wars in April of 1792. Rising up against years of exploitation, French peasants looted and burned the houses of tax collectors, landlords, and other aristocratic elites throughout the country. Known as the Great Terror, aristocrats fled for their lives into other parts of Europe, setting off more than a decade of violence and repeated legislative reforms that would eventually lead to the trial and execution of King Louis XVI on January 21, 1793, followed by his wife Marie Antoinette 9 months later. Spurred on by the success of the American Revolution, by June of 1793, the French Revolution shifted into its most violent phase, when the Jacobins in the National Convention seized power from the more moderate Girondin Party, unleashing a 10-month killing spree known as the Reign of Terror, which saw the beheading of 16,600 alleged counter-revolutionaries. Many of the executions were carried out under orders from Maximilien Robespierre, who dominated the Committee of Public Safety until his own execution on July 28, 1794. His death ushered in the Thermidorian reaction, when moderate Frenchmen revolted against the excesses of the Reign of Terror. On November 9, 1799, just as frustration over French leadership reached another incendiary point, Napoleon Bonaparte staged a coup d'état, disbanding the French government after appointing himself first consul. The event marked the end of the French Revolution, turning full circle into a modified aristocracy all its own, when Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of France on December 2, 1802. Flight to Varennes. As the French Revolution raged on, with the hopes of abolishing its long tradition of monarchic rule in exchange for a democratic republic, French King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette were forcibly removed from their residence at Versailles to their Parisian-based Tuileries Palace, where they retained their titles and opulent lifestyle, despite their inability to leave the palace grounds. Believing that Parisian radicals were a minority voice in the calls for revolution, as spring turned to summer, Louis XVI decided to escape his imprisonment in an attempt to lead counter-revolutionary forces of some 10,000 pro-monarchy troops and royalist officers at the castle fortification at Montmedy. On the night of June 20th and the early morning of June 21st, the Queen disguised herself as a governess, while the King was disguised as her personal valet, escaping with their children in a series of delays and poor judgments, in particular, the King's mistaken belief that his monarchy had the full support of French peasants and other commoners. Headed for the Austrian border, the royal caravan made a stop at Saint-Ménehould, where a French official matched the King's face to his image on French paper currency. By the time the royal caravan reached the small town of Varennes in Argonne, they were arrested and forcibly returned to their Parisian confinement. The King's attempted escape sent shockwaves through the people of France, further inciting the systematic slaughter of aristocrats during what became known as the Terror, as well as exponentially increasing popular hostility towards the French monarchy. The King's attempted escape also provoked charges of treason, which ultimately led to his beheading on January 21, 1793, followed by Marie Antoinette's execution 9 months later. The King's brother, Louis XVIII, also fled France on the night of June 20th, spending his near-penniless exile in England until he was crowned King of France in 1814, making the flight to Varennes a turning point moment in the rapidly devolving French Revolution. Today on the Daily Dose, the Age of Enlightenment. Following the scientific revolution, which included the work of Francis Bacon and Thomas Hobbes, Galileo, Johann Kepler, and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, the Age of Enlightenment was a largely European intellectual and scholarly movement that spanned from the 17th to the 19th centuries. Some date the beginning of the Enlightenment to René Descartes' 1637 essay entitled Cogito ergo sum, or in English, I think, therefore I am. Others cite the publication of Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica in 1686, or John Locke's essay concerning human understanding in 1689. French historians traditionally peg the dates of the beginning of the Enlightenment to the death of Louis XIV in 1715, until the start of the French Revolution in 1789, although the majority of historians affix the end of Enlightenment with the beginning of the 19th century. Known as the High Enlightenment, the high-water years of the period ran from 1730 to 1780 and was centered around the dialogues and publications of French philosophers Voltaire, Rousseau, Montesquieu, and Denis Diderot. Foremost among the interchange of ideas was Voltaire's notion that everything in the universe could be rationally demystified and cataloged. Philosophers and scientists during the Age of Enlightenment circulated ideas through regular meetings held at scientific academies, Masonic lodges, and literary salons, as well as in printed materials such as books, journals, and essay pamphlets. Many of the more persistent ideas undermined the authority of monarchies, which included debates on liberty, liberalism and neoclassicism, religious tolerance, constitutional government, and the separation of church and state. The period further threatened the authority of the Catholic Church when intellectuals employed scientific methodology and reductionism to question religious dogma and orthodoxy, an attitude captured best in Immanuel Kant's essay entitled Answering the Question, What is Enlightenment?, where the phrase supera aude, or dare to know, can be found. Many educated Christians of the period sought to readjust their faith along rational lines, arguing that nature, biology, and the universe appeared to determine its own course of action without God's intervention. Taken as a whole, many scholars believe that the Age of Enlightenment opened the door for the political revolutions of the 18th and 19th centuries, including those of the Americans and the French. And there you have it, The Age of Enlightenment, today on the Daily Dose.